At around that time, I also met, Terrence McKenna.
Of course, yeah.
He turned me on to DMT for the first time. The main thrust of the experience was witnessing this waterfall of flaming colors, out of which emerged about a half dozen little creatures, like little grays, little gray
Oh, wow.
aliens. And they were maybe 50 yards away, 25 yards away, like in my mind's eye. And they were telepathically, drilling into my head. Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see? Just over and over and over again. And I was just like slack-jawed.
Of course. Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. What if there is a hyper real yet hyper alien realm just beyond the horizon of our perception? Well, to quote the great Terrence McKenna, and I'm really fighting the urge to overuse and abuse my Terrence McKenna impression here, is there an invisible nearby world inhabited by active intelligences with which human beings can communicate? You bet. And if you don't think so, tell me you don't think so after you've tried DMT. If you know what I'm talking about, Dr. Rick Strassman probably needs no introduction, but this man is a true trailblazer. He really is ahead of his time. He put his reputation on the line for what he believes in, for what he thought was right, for his calling. More specifically, he took a huge risk in the early 90s. He pushed for and eventually got clearance to do the first psychedelic studies in the United States in 20 years. Studies on DMT, no less. This led to him writing the now famous DMT, The Spirit Molecule, and to a fabulous documentary by the same name, which summarizes that research, shares the life-changing experiences of the participants in the study, along with some potential philosophical implications of it all. He's also the author of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, and his latest, My Altered States, in which Rick gets really personal for the first time. And on that note, this is probably the best time to riff with Dr. Strassman, because he's just beyond caring. He really lets it fly at this point in his life. Dr. Strassman is a longtime associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, but he's interested in a lot more than just the technical and medical aspects of this conversation. He's deeply philosophical, deeply spiritual. I don't want to gush, but it really is a huge honor to riff with Dr. Strassman. Let's just get into this one. All the links that you're going to need for him are in the description, including the link for his new book, My Altered States. Same for Third Eye Drops. My friends, tickle that algorithm. Like, sub, comment, share. It really means a lot. Did you know we've got hundreds of mind melds over on the audio feed with many brilliant beings, many on this topic, including at least one with Dr. Strassman. So do sub to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to pods. And if you want to go deeper, if you personally want to riff with me and hundreds of other seekers, join a patron-only Discord server, book club, participate in Zoom mind melds, receive rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, then initiate yourself into our Wonder Lodge over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would truly love to riff with you there, but for now, presently, let's do so with the great Dr. Rick Strassman. Although it has been a long time since you and I spoke, 2016, as we were just saying, that's nothing in terms of how long you've been at this. And, DMT itself it's been in the zeitgeist. It's been penetrating the zeitgeist. But I think lately it's really been having a reemergence in the last couple of years. And I think there's a few reasons for that. But for people that don't know, now the idea, let's say, of doing an experiment with DMT, an above board experiment, still novel, still interesting, still a little bit on the fringe. But compared to when you started, it was a completely unheard of, almost outlandish idea. And I was thinking back to the DMT, the spirit molecule studies, and I could not remember what it was that made you so drawn to it that you were willing to push and push and push to get those studies through, to get those studies signed off on. So will you just take me back to that time in your life and what it was that made you so committed to exploring the substance?
I think it went in stages. The first idea of studying the biology of spiritual experience came to me in my early 20s. And I was first, drawn to the pineal gland. And at that time, there wasn't much known about melatonin.
Hmm.
Um, so the main reason that I went to medical school, at least in the beginning, was to um, in the future do research on the biology of spiritual states. Once I got all of the training necessary, um, I studied melatonin quite carefully. In the mid 1980s, when I ran that melatonin study, there wasn't very much known about the substance. There were some hints that it was psychedelic, but as we now know, it's mostly sedating. Um, but the initial impetus, I think, even for the study of the biology of spiritual experience, was my own experiences, which were, I don't know if you call them spiritual, but they were certainly altered, and they had similarities to spiritual experience as articulated, particularly in Buddhism.
Hmm.
So I was interested in the biology of meditation, the biology of psychedelics, and I suppose the umbrella would be the biology of altered states.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I was always interested in chemistry as a kid. Had chemistry sets, made bombs, made fireworks. I even started college as a chemistry major. And once I started having my own experience, I thought, these experiences are coming around or they're coming about through changes in brain chemistry. And I was just, curious, chemistry folks, like to tinker with chemistry. So I wanted to both, study these states and to experience as many as I could at that time. Um, once the melatonin research wound down and I found it was, primarily sedating,
Hmm.
I had learned about, DMT in the meantime. It was made in the body like melatonin. It was a known psychedelic, and had been studied in humans before. So I, changed my direction and started started putting, um, the DMT project together.
Hmm.
Um, at around that time, I also met, Terence McKenna,
Of course. Yeah.
like a major spokesman for the DMT state, and he turned me on to DMT for the first time. And by then it was like, okay, I want to study this drug. I want to give it to people. I want to, see what it's doing. Um,
Did
y-
he?
you know,
I'm sorry. Did he turn you onto it just intellectually, or turn you onto it experientially as well?
experientially,
I
I had
didn't know
been.
this. I didn't know this somehow.
Yeah, we were at a conference on the West Coast, California Central Coast. Yeah, and I had given a talk. I uh, I'm at a conference on melatonin, DMT, the pineal gland. And afterwards, Terrence came up to me and he said, "Oh, you're talking about DMT. Would you like to try some?" So I said, "Sure." Yeah, and an hour or two later, I was on a little bedroom with some friends and with Terrence, and yeah, and
Beautiful.
yeah, he supervised my first DMT experience.
That's
Yeah,
so
so then
surreal.
then I was hooked. Like, okay, this is the holy grail, and I want to pursue it and see where it leads.
Amazing. Yeah. Somehow I didn't know that. Was there a time where you weren't sharing that story?
I have just started, talking more
Yeah.
about my own experiences. Well, this new book that came out, My
Yeah.
Alter States, is all about, my own experiences. I think that may have been the first story. Oh yeah, and it was the first story that I told about my own experiences. It was at an event in Sedona with Graham Hancock, and I figured, well, I'll just come out
Yeah.
now, and that's a good coming out story.
It sure is. It sure is. Yeah, having the turn on from McKenna and his, I can just imagine him approaching you with like a smile on his face, like, "Well, you're talking about DMT. Why don't you try it?" Like, I can just see it. Yeah. So it is, and what Is that experience just like seared into your memory? Like, what was that first experience like? Was it the classical? Did you break through and everything?
Yeah, it was, fairly classical, although, back then I didn't, really know, what
Right.
classical experience was. Um, yeah, Terrence, said, take as many hits as you can, and when you don't think you can take another, then, take another. And in a few minutes, I'll ask you if you could do more, and if you can, sit up, and I'll give you, one more hit. So I think I took three big hits. I laid down. The visions began. Then in a few minutes, I heard him say, "Would you like more?" And I sat up, and I had one more big hit. Um, yeah, and I laid back down. Um, yeah, the main thrust of the experience was witnessing this waterfall of flaming colors, out of which emerged about a half dozen little creatures, like little grays, little
Oh
gray
wow.
aliens, that emerged out of the
Yeah.
waterfall. Uh, and they just were little, and they were maybe 50 yards away, 25 yards away, like in my mind's eye. And they were telepathically, drilling into my head. Now do you see? Now do you see?
Mhm.
Now do you see? Just over and over and over again. And I was just like slack-jawed. I
Of
had no
course.
idea. Yeah, yeah. And I started fading. And I came about. Yeah, and yeah, I think about that experience regularly. And it's a good question. Now do you see? Like, what does that exactly mean? Or is it even a question? It could be interpreted as now you do see. So, you
Amazing.
know, interesting. Yeah, so after that experience, I was, fairly sold on the idea of looking into DMT. And
Understandably, yeah.
it wasn't only that I wanted to study DMT. I wanted to, learn about the world and the information contained in that world that was revealed under the influence of DMT. So in a way, my interests have kind of evolved away from the drugs themselves, more
Mhm.
into, what's the nature of the information contained in that state? How do you use it? How do you make the most of it?
For sure. Yeah, that's centrally my interest as well. Just a sidebar. I've never had an experience that is very like the classical gray experience, but I know people do experience that. I didn't know you had had that experience. Have you had other experiences with gray like beings?
Um, I think the first time I smoked 5-methoxy DMT, which is usually uh, it's usually associated with the classic kind of white out ego death
Mhm.
experience.
Mhm.
Yeah, I saw like hundreds of little snow white dwarves,
Wow.
circling around on a catwalk in a big silo. Um, so I suppose if you equate, or if the Snow White, sort of dwarves with their long, floppy capes and hats and stuff, are equivalent, to the Greys or to the beings. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had an experience like that before too.
Wow. Yeah, I want to talk more about the phenomenology of the experiences, the beings, the realms, the ontological reality or lack thereof, all of that stuff. But before we get too far away from it, um, clearing that bar scientifically, making the justification to do these studies, would really, it seems like that part of it is kind of had to be a bit of a Trojan horse for your actual philosophical interest in what was going on. And of course, on that note, I mean, probably 99% of people who know who you are and are fans of your work are probably a bit foggy on, wait, what was the scientific justification for those studies in the first place? Because the phenomenology and the psychology and just the philosophical questions that came out of those studies are just so legendary and captivating now, that people think about that first and foremost. But how did you? I know you've talked about like having to clear that bar and it being difficult, but how did you end up justifying those studies?
Um, well, that's a good question, and it's a bit, roundabout. There were, kind of covert agendas and overt agendas as well. Like I was, trained in psychiatry, psychopharmacology. Psychedelics used to be the wonder drugs in the 50s and the 60s.
Hmm.
Then they became the horror drugs, and after that they just disappeared. Nobody knew anything about psychedelics within the academic world. They weren't being taught about. I think I had 1 hour lecture as a medical student on the psychedelics, and it was a it was from a basic scientist, working with animals. Wasn't even a clinical person. Um, so part of me was keen on reopening area of research that had been quite promising in the beginning, until it ran into some obstacles, obviously. Um, you know, I was interested, I guess, covertly in, is DMT inherently spiritual?
Yeah.
If you give the drug and keep your hands off of the person, just say, you have your trip, and tell us what happened. I was under the impression that, or not under the impression, but I was hopeful, or was thinking it was possible, that just the pure drug itself would lead to an enlightened state.
Hmm.
In which case we'd have instant enlightenment. The messianic era would be upon us. Peace on earth. And that was a throwback to kind of a manic episode that started off in college when I
Mm.
couldn't really put together a cogent a cogent essay for my medical school application. Yeah, so one night I dropped acid, and it just came to me I was going to combine Zen and psychoanalysis and psychopharmacology into this universal healing modality. And I wrote 20 pages, and showed it to my uh, neuroscience mentor I was working with at the time, and it was pretty nuts. And he said, "This is nuts. You can't send it. What's the matter with you?" So I toned it down. And even then, every interview that I had, when they asked me why I wanted, um, to go to medical school, I told them. And this was 1972, just a couple of years after the Controlled Substances Act had
Right.
been passed.
Right.
Yeah, and I was 20 years old. I had no background in Zen, no background in psychopharmacology, no background in psychoanalysis, and I was rejected by pretty much every school that asked me that question. Why do you want to be a doctor? Um, so I kept it to myself after that. I actually dropped out of school after a year because my ideals and the reality on the ground of being a medical student didn't they didn't really match at all. You learn just and I ended up at a Zen monastery in order to start learning about Buddhism.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I went back to medical school, and it was just when studying, just study. When chopping vegetables, just chop vegetables. All those grandiose plans I just put on the back burner. But still, I in that manifesto that I wrote as a junior in college, uh, I believed, or I proposed, that if everybody had a big enough altered state experience, they would be healed. So that was one of my questions that I brought into my DMT research. If you just give enough DMT to people and you let them have their experience without guiding it in any particular way, was it inherently spiritual? So that was one of my major kind of unspoken questions. The other questions which were overt and which I utilized in submitting my application for permits, grant funding, those kinds of things,
Hmm.
were basic psychopharmacology. DMT is, the prototypical, tryptamine hallucinogen. It can give us insight into uh, other longer acting, psychedelics like LSD and, psilocybin. Um, it's naturally occurring, which means that it might, shed some light on endogenous psychoses as
Yeah.
well. Like if people made, too much DMT or were abnormally sensitive to it, that might result in, the symptoms of schizophrenia, for
Right.
example.
Right.
People were using, psychedelics, um, in the field, and there were Schedule One, compounds, so we
Was
needed to
DMT
know.
at that time, or did when did DMT go on the Schedule One?
It went on the original list of
Oh, it
drugs.
did. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it was a drug of abuse, the prototypical, compound within a family of abusable drugs,
In
and
air
we ought to,
quotes.
right, right, and we ought to understand how it works. Yeah, and the other, uh, you know, I guess justification, was, that even though human studies had ended more or less in 1970, the animal data was, continuing to accumulate using
Hmm.
LSD, mostly in the discovery of different kinds of serotonin receptors and endocrine effects of LSD,
Interesting.
electrophysiological ones. And we needed to either, confirm the animal data in humans or refute the animal data, studying humans.
Hmm.
We wanted to develop an assay to measure DMT in the blood. We wanted to develop a new questionnaire to quantify, psychedelic subjective effects. Yeah, so it was all pretty, um, like, as far as the granting and the funding agencies, the regulatory agencies, um, it was an up and up, kind of study,
Yeah.
like any other mind altering drug, understand how it works, what's the biology, what are the subjective effects.
Hmm. Hmm. So you do end up doing this study. It becomes this, for anybody in this scene, they've heard of DMT, the spirit molecule. It becomes this very famous sequence of studies. Becomes a book. Becomes a documentary. Um, of course, fast forwarding, like so much has happened. But one of the things that I was curious about now that these extended state DMT studies from Imperial College are happening is I'm foggy on the details of, because you were doing intravenous DMT. How long were your participants being administered the DMT for in your studies?
Yeah, it was just a single administration.
Okay.
So we gave it over the space of around 45 seconds. Like 30 seconds, for the infusion of the drug itself. We just, squirted it using a, syringe, and then we, flushed the line with salt water for around an extra 15 seconds. Yeah, so the effects begin immediately. They peak at 2 to 5, and you're feeling relatively normal 20, 25, 30 minutes after that. We weren't able to develop, tolerance to closely spaced repeated dosings of
Hmm.
DMT in one of our studies. We gave it every half hour on a full dose in order, to determine if, people's subjective experience, lessened with repeated dosing. That's called tolerance.
Hmm.
With other compounds like LSD, psilocybin, you take it every day and you pretty much stop responding after three
Yeah.
or 4 days. But that had not been established in either humans or in animals. And in fact, there was an animal study where they gave cats a big dose of DMT every
Wow.
2 hours for 21 days,
Poor
and there
cats.
was no behavioral tolerance. So I thought, well, maybe you need to space the infusions or the injections, closer together, to produce tolerance. Yeah, so we couldn't really give it any closer than every half hour, and the fourth, dose was as strong subjectively as the first dose. So we weren't able to demonstrate tolerance.
Hmm.
Toward the end of my DMT book, I suggested a continuous infusion might be possible because there was no tolerance. Yeah, and then a few years later, Andrew Gallimore,
Yeah.
I'm a Brit who's in Japan now,
Mm-hmm.
approached me and he said, would you like to write a theoretical modeling paper about how might you do that, like a continuous infusion. Yeah, so that paper came out in 2016, and it spurred the Imperial college group to actually start working on the protocol. There's also a Swiss group that's been doing continuous infusions too, and a group in San Diego that's working on getting one of those continuous infusions studies up and running.
Fascinating. Yeah, talking to Gallimore a couple of times. I also have become friends with Alexander Biner, who was in the extended state trial at Imperial College. You may have talked to him at some point. Were you ever on the channel Rebel Wisdom on YouTube?
I don't think so. But Ali and I have
Oh, great.
spoken at least once. We had a long Zoom call at least one time. I mean, he wrote that book about
Yeah.
his experiences at
Yeah, the
Imperial.
bigger picture. Great book.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, these are it doesn't surprise me. These, it as popular as it's getting, the circles are still small and everybody's fairly connected. But I'm curious, a fun question that I asked Gallimore is what, like, if you had to try to explain or define what DMT is, and, you know, philosophically, practically, what do you think the best word for it is? And I don't think you'd be shocked to hear that he likes the word technology. Like, he thinks it's a technology that, for lack of a better term, or to just greatly nutshell it, a technology that connects us to some kind of alien information, or information that we normally don't have access to. And by information, as you know, this is all encompassing. This is uh, experience. This is actual um, input that is some kind of raw data that our brain somehow figures out a way to instantaneously map, as overwhelming and hyperbolic as it is. So I guess I'll ask you the same question. What if you do you like this idea of it being a technology, or how, what do you think of it as?
Um, well, I suppose my answer would comport with Andrew's. Like I would call it a chemical substance. It's a compound.
Yeah.
It's a molecule. So it begins as a chemical entity. Um, yeah, and what it does, it obviously changes the activity of the mind-brain complex, for lack of a better word, um, and it reveals information that was not visible previously. So that could be externally existent information, internally existent information that we didn't have access to before. But like in the spirit molecule, towards the end, I, speculate, fairly wild-eyedly about all, like parallel universes and
Mm-hmm,
dark
mm-hmm.
matter, things like that. And, suggest or at least hypothesize that, DMT, changes the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex, and we
Yeah.
can now, see into external levels of reality that we couldn't before, like a microscope or like a telescope. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case, and there's really no way to prove it right now. So I think a more generic model would be that it reveals previously invisible information, which may reside within us, might reside out there. I think in the jury is still out. Like we were talking about earlier. Earlier though, I think the most important thing is not to locate necessarily the source of that information, but to extract as much information as we
Mm-hmm.
can from those states, and make the world and ourselves
Yeah.
better off for it.
Yeah, I'm tempted to get into some of the philosophical speculation now. I don't know if I want to detract. I guess our coherent storyline has already kind of,
Frayed.
disintegrated. So I may as well ask. But I love that in the new book you bring up this idea of active intellect, because I've been going down this rabbit hole of broadly Platonism, and you draw this from Aristotle, from my memory, Aristotle's metaphysics. But immediately I was like, okay, this has to be, if I go look the Greek up, this has to be nous that he's talking about. And I figured out that he actually distinguishes between an active nous and a passive nous. And I didn't know this before because my Aristotle's metaphysics isn't as good as my Platonic, but yeah, I would love to hear you riff on that idea and how you came across this as a possibility. That I guess, if I didn't contextualize it well enough, that there sort of is this sphere of mind, and that perhaps things like DMT and other spiritual practices that don't require, an exogenous chemical, um, that perhaps we can access this sphere to some degree.
Hmm. Well, that's so I understand the active intellect. I had not heard of, the passive intellect. So how does Aristotle define that?
From a quick look, it was something to the effect of, it's the sort of capacity of mind that receives versus the one that's active, or something like that.
So the passive intellect, let's see,
And it
I
was,
have
I can't
it,
recall I think the active intellect is something like poeticos nous, but I
yeah,
can't remember what the passive one was.
yeah, I've got Wikipedia up here for the passive intellect. It's also translated as potential intellect or material intellect. It's used alongside the notion of active intellect in order to give an account of the operation of the intellect, nous, in accord with the theory of hylomorphism, which I had not heard of. Well, so does the passive intellect reside in our minds?
See, this is where I get foggy, because nous is one of those concepts that it depends which thinker. But in the classical sense, I mean, Platonists and the person who's credited with this idea of nous, the pre-Socratic philosopher, Anaxagoras. This is not just a personal thing, but we are participating in it personally. So I think of it as like, um, something that we're both, our own root system as a being sort of exists within this larger phenomenon of nous, would be the way that I would, I guess, try to encapsulate it. But I don't know if this idea of active and passive, I think that's a later Aristotelian idea, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, yeah. I've not read the metaphysics. I've only read Aristotle, through the medieval philosophers.
Yeah,
Which and you know, like Aristotle was first translated into Arabic,
yeah.
and after that, the Jewish medieval philosophers read the Arabic and then translated him into Hebrew.
Hmm.
So or I don't know if they translated him into Hebrew, but they learned about Aristotle, through the Arabic translations.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, well, I first learned about the active intellect in my study of prophecy,
yeah,
which is the ultimate spiritual experience in the Hebrew Bible, the textbook of Judaism, and the precursor for the Christian Bible, and in some ways the Quran. Yeah, and Maimonides was a great medieval Jewish philosopher. Lived
yeah,
in Egypt in the 1200s. It's interesting. Dogen, who
yeah,
brought Buddhism from from China to Japan. He lived at the same time as Maimonides,
interesting.
in the first half of the 1200s. So that was a very fertile time all around the world for
Yeah.
like unbelievably mind blowing intellectual and philosophical spiritual developments. Yeah, so Maimonides, was a philosopher and a physician and a court person, for the vizier of, I think, Fostat, which is near Alexandria, perhaps, in Egypt. And he was keen on reconciling modern science, which at the time was Neoplatonic Aristotelianism.
Yeah.
The spheres, emanation,
Yeah.
those kinds of things. And he referred a lot to the active intellect as a repository of information which resided in what was called the sublunar sphere,
Yes.
which exists between the Earth and the Moon. And it was the only sphere that the human mind was capable of perceiving, comprehending. The higher spheres were incomprehensible. They didn't use the same kind of currency of words
Right.
and images and perceptions and stuff. The only thing that we could apprehend, like that we could see, feel, think about, existed in the sublunar sphere. The most primitive of the nine spheres. So that was a repository of information, which contained everything which occurred in the past, everything occurring now, and all potential future outcomes. So it was incomprehensibly vast. If you think about parallel universes, all yes, splitting off from this moment and then the next moment and the next moment, an infinite number of future possibilities. It's a vast repository of information.
Yeah.
Basically incomprehensible. So one of the experiences in the new book, My Altered States, is about a couple of past life experiences. One in the Ukraine with my paternal grandfather in the early 1900s. One in a concentration camp in Poland in the 1940s. And I was speculating after that narrative as to how that might occur. And one of the models that I put out there, was the active intellect and being able, to tap into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so people tap into the active intellect, through their minds. And according to Aristotle, there's the intellect, which is everything abstract, conceptual, thoughts, insights, almost mathematical, and the imagination, which is the arena that contains everything else, feelings and somatic effects and emotions and perceptions. So depending on the philosopher, if you stimulate either the intellect and or the imagination, and you can do that with meditation or with drugs, you then become more receptive to information residing in the active intellect, and it downloads, and it is revealed in the imagination. You can see it, you can hear it, you can feel it, and then it's up to your intellect to extract the information which is contained in the images and the feelings. In the prophetic states, that information is downloaded as a result of the divine wanting to communicate with humans a certain amount, certain quality of information, and then to share it. In the psychedelic state, it's more personal. And in that first chapter in My Altered States in that new book, I think if one were to speculate on the imagination and the active intellect playing a role, it was a result of a set and setting. It was me at that time. I was 33, 34 years old. I was in a research group, studying new psychedelics. There was a slight, whiff of anti-Semitism in the group. And Yeah, it just took me there. So the insights or the understandings or the the information which one encounters in the active intellect is dependent on you. What's most and what resonates.
Yeah, it's like synchronistic almost or something.
Yeah, yeah. What's the resonance between you at that moment and the contents, the vast and
Yeah,
comprehensively large contents of the active intellect.
yeah.
So there is some kind of resonance which which occurs.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea that I feel like you're hinting at, they would have called correspondence or sympathy, like that there is this unseen sort of connecting grammar between the above and the below, and that this sublunary. It's interesting because if you're not initiated into this sort of like Western esoteric milieu, you might not be familiar with all these ideas. But if you look up any sort of, you know, map of not, you get this picture of a geocentric cosmos surrounded by seven spheres with an eighth outer sphere called the sphere of the fixed stars. We today look at this and say this is just incorrect astronomy, right? But to the ancients, I feel like this was something that was a type of wisdom that was a synthesis between this intelligible kind of knowing, this kind of knowing that you're talking about, that you get to through the mind itself, through going into the psyche itself deeply, and also what they were seeing in the outside world and trying to make some kind of imagery that comported with both the inner and the outer. And each of these concentric spheres, starting with the Earth, but then you go to the Moon, then you go to either Mercury or Venus, depending on the order, et cetera, through the seven classical planets. Each of these spheres is akin to a kind of archetypal quality or deity, which is, as you said, emanating outward and also kind of influencing our reality. Um,
Well, they're emanating downward. They're emanating downward. From the highest spheres to the lowest.
yes, all the way back to some kind of undivided, pre-concept one, basically, in almost every version. And then that ends up getting co-opted, basically, or it ends up getting absorbed into Christianity and Judaism through people like Pseudo Dionysus and all these other philosophers. But it really doesn't make that much sense until you go back to some of these earlier sources, like Aristotle, like Plato, like some of the Neoplatonic philosophers. Then it all starts to kind of like make sense together. But anyway, yeah, this idea of the sublunary sphere is really interesting because this is sort of the realm in which the collective human psyche operates, the anima mundi that like surrounds the whole planet, essentially, that we are all participating in, which has gone kind of by many names. The active nous, the it's kind of like the noosphere, which is a little different but similar. But yeah, the idea remains is that we are connected to this thing, this phenomenon of collective mind, but we are, when we're metacognating, when we're in everyday ego-based reality, we're very unaware of it. But perhaps through dreaming, perhaps through altered states, perhaps through deep meditation and disassociating from the body, from the ego, we can start to absorb or become aware of some of that information. And that does seem like a good hypothesis to me too, for sure.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that one of the goals anyway of the prophetic states books that I wrote in 2014, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, was to introduce the idea of the active intellect, the imagination, the human intellect into a discussion of altered states, because I think it provides a more theological or spiritual or more abstract
Yeah.
philosophical approach, which could be studied. I mean, there isn't any reason why you have to limit your theory building, purely to the brain. You can work on perhaps locating the active, the intellect.
Hmm.
Like where I'm in the brain is the intellect, where in the brain is the imagination, and how do spiritual practices affect either of them or both of them. How do psychedelics, how does meditation, so I think it's a neglected model which was quite rigorously worked on back in the days by very bright people.
Right.
So I don't think it is anything that ought to be considered completely kind of passe. I think with current scientific technologies, tools, ideas, we ought to be able to look at that model again. The actual the spheres themselves, Maimonides, and I suppose based on Aristotle, he described them as intelligences
Yeah.
or angels.
Yeah.
They do his bidding. They do God's bidding. Like a non-corporeal God, an
Hmm.
immaterial God. How does an immaterial God influence the material world? And it's through the spheres.
Yeah. Yeah, and that goes back all the way at least to Plato's Timaeus, if not, I'm sure before that as well. This picture of there being this non-physical mind that is ordering the cosmos and then creates each planet as a sort of, essentially, to have some kind of archetypal quality and job that helps to govern and organize reality. Um, yeah, it's a captivating idea for me, that's for sure. And it also goes a long way towards comporting with my own altered state experiences and experiences that are beyond normal everyday consciousness. Um, and it's participatory. It's not just like, some of it's theoretical, sure. Like I haven't had a direct experience of all of these ideas, but this sort of emanatory metaphysics largely really harmonizes much, much better than the sort of, I don't know, slapped, what feels more like a slap together metaphysics in terms of popular religion that never quite made sense to me. But anyway, um
Yeah, well, the current theological model, spiritual model is this mishmash of
yes.
mystical Christianity, Vedanta Hinduism, New Age, bells and whistles. Yeah, but there are rigorous models for how the mind works and how it interacts with invisible realities, which was worked out by the greatest minds in the world at the time. So I think it's worth revisiting.
Definitely. And I know you mentioned Maimonides. Is he one of the primary ones that you look to?
Well, in understanding the mechanics of the prophetic state, I relied on him. Um, and one of his goals, was to get people who were faithful, that believed in the Hebrew Bible, the text and the narratives and the laws, to help them negotiate apparent conflicts between science and faith.
Hmm.
So he explained things in the text using an Aristotelian lens. Like God's hand does not mean like a
Right.
physical hand; it means
Right.
God's power. And he would give a lot of examples of the Hebrew word for for the hand, yad, meaning authority or power or dominion, as opposed to a physical hand. Yeah, so he went through the text with a number of examples of how you can understand without too much difficulty, the the need of the Bible to speak in what's called the language of man.
Yeah.
It needs to be understandable, like a immaterial God and an incorporeal God that interacts with us through the spheres was just too abstract for the common man. And it was easier to think of a God with a hand and who saw and who heard and things like that, for the widest possible audience. Um, yeah, and he spends a lot of time describing the mechanism of the prophetic state and comparing and contrasting it to other altered states, like divination, like, being a politician, like being a scientist. Yeah, so there are skills which emanate or emerge from a hypertrophied intellect versus a hypertrophied imagination.
Mm.
When they're in balance, how you can stimulate the imagination, how you can stimulate the intellect. So, yeah, it's a fairly, fairly practical system as well.
Definitely super interesting. Before we get too far away from it, though, these emerging studies with DMT, one of the things Alexander Biner told me about that he originally thought he was going to participate in is a study aimed at doing one of the things we sort of brushed up against, which is trying to see if you can gain shared experiences in the DMT state, and if those experiences could be documented rigorously enough in an experimental setting that you could prove some kind of shared experience. For people who this might sound outlandish to, this is just something you're going to hear all the time in people's ayahuasca experiences, people's DMT experiences, anecdotally. But do you think this is actually something that could be studied scientifically and that we could prove?
I think so, but the studies haven't really yet been uh, designed well enough. You're speaking about paranormal, psi kinds of things. Yeah, David Luke in England is a keen student, scientist, looking at enhanced telepathy
Yeah.
under psychedelics. Yeah, and even though there's an enormous amount of data from the field, so to speak, the laboratory studies have yet to reveal any psi on a reliable basis anyway. But I think the studies still need refinement in their design. Like you just can't put one person in a room in a lab, somebody else in a room in a lab. Give them psychedelics and you see if they're able to share experiences, emotional or perceptual or cognitive. But it's a real thing. Like one of the chapters in my book is the first time I smoked a cannabis product. It was some very strong hashish. And one of the things which occurred that night is that my roommate and I were sitting on a carpet on the floor, and the floor gave way, and we were flying over the town where the college where I was attending was, and we were sharing the vision of what was down there. Oh, do you see those beach umbrellas? Do you see the park? Do you see the the power lines? Yeah, and we were steering the carpet, together. Like, sometimes I would take over, sometimes he would take over. Yeah, it was the damnedest thing. And it went on for a good 15, 20 minutes. Yeah, so I know firsthand that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah, and you don't have to justify that one for me because I don't want to get into my story right now, but I just went to, are you familiar with the Monroe Institute?
Yeah.
I just went there for the first time, and I guess to cut right to the chase, I had a full blown OBE, and I am unbelievably fortunate to be the only person in the entire group who had like the classical like real separation sort of experience. So I don't know if that's what you were alluding to, is that you actually feel like there's a chance that that was not just a shared psychological experience, but that you were actually in some sense doing what it seemed like you were doing. But if that's what you were proposing, my mind has been open to it in a very real way very recently. In your heart of hearts, do you think that could have been a real shared non-corporeal experience?
It seemed to be. Yeah, people share feelings, right? At the same time. And thoughts at the same time. Oh, I was just thinking that. Oh, I was too at the same time. Yeah. So why not, shared perceptions?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Um, how would you design an experiment then that might really be able to prove that some kind of shared, not only shared experience is real, but shared perception of the DMT realm? Because then the direct implication off of that is that is some kind of freestanding place that two people or more than two people are witnessing at the same time.
Yeah, or it could be just resonance between two people's mind brain complexes.
True.
Like a dream, like a shared dream. Maybe. I was on Joe Rogan's podcast a week or two ago. Yeah, and he was talking
Oh wow.
about uh, uh, Neuralink
Hmm.
chips, which would allow worldwide communication among all humans. So shared experience, and the end of lying, the end of deceit. Like a new world
Hmm.
order. Well, like a utopia, more or less. Yeah, so
Or a new kind of dystopia we can't even imagine.
right. I thought that was a bad idea, actually. When he was, waxing eloquently about it, I said, "I'm not so sure that's a good idea. It could be turned pretty bad." Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess you could use technology to see if you could share experiences like that. But nowadays, like with our current state of science, state of the art, how would you design a study like that? Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess you'd need to ask Rupert Sheldrake. He's been doing
Mm,
all kinds of studies like that over the years. Like in the field,
yeah.
and his and he's accumulated a lot of fairly convincing data about paranormal shared phenomena, in the wild. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
how would you design that? Yeah, I just don't know. I haven't really looked into parapsychological
Hmm.
research design.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of this idea, like the idea that Sheldrake is so famous for, morphic fields, morphic resonance, the idea that groups can develop this sort of hive mind or have some kind of shared extra perceptory awareness of the group. Um, I do think that was probably going on during my Monroe retreat because when we would do the way it's structured is you do, 4 to 6 of these hemisync meditations a day. Um, and then after the meditation, you come back to the group and you all kind of have a share. And I was really keen to share even things that I thought were out of left field or very weird because I was hoping, somebody else is going to say, I had that kind of experience too. And there were at least a few very out of left field things that people talked about that immediately hands went up and they were like, I had a very similar experience. And so to give an example, one person is like, I know this is coming out of nowhere, but I was having this vision of all of these glass vessels on the ground, like glasses, like cups filled with some kind of liquid. And then other people raise their hands, are like, I had that too. Or things like I was getting this weird violent imagery, and then other people would raise their hands and say, I was too. So what to make of that? I don't know. Could it be coincidence? Could be, but it's so strange and specific, that it makes you wonder um, what more parsimonious explanation there would be than some kind of shared dream or visionary space.
Well, so how do they explain it? What's the mechanism of action according to those folks?
I don't think they settle on any one explanation. I mean, to them, I think they're just very generally open to all possibilities and encourage people to lean into their imagination, to lean into the true possibility that your consciousness can extend beyond your physical form. And through that, I mean, you could justify almost anything. So, they were trying to propagate, I don't think, one specific worldview, but they're definitely coming from the POV that a lot of things are possible. I think. But yeah, there's not a lot of dogma. The only real piece of dogma there is they really want you to believe that you're more than your physical body and that you can therefore perceive things beyond your physical body. And that's really the only, a lot of ideas are thrown around and talked about and entertained, but that's
Right.
really the only one that you're always coming back to on that retreat.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so it's more of a practical orientation. You can do this, because of things being different than what they seem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, you could adduce non-locality, things like that. And, the active intellect, could also be, playing a role. You're all in the same space. You're all
Mhm.
working on the same, project more or less. Yeah. And, depending, you can tap into things out there, which, um, other people in that state in the group could also be tapping into at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting though, glass, vessels, filled with some kind of liquid.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me think of like the cups tarot suit or like the symbolism of vessels. And then that, I mean, I could go down a whole Jungian riff of like which represents the element of water, and the water is associated with the unconscious and the collective unconscious. Like I could go down that whole road, but I don't know. I don't know.
Or it may have been that somebody was needed to drink of water.
Yeah, yeah, right. It could be. Yeah, you never know. You never know. My mind, it's just so interesting how with all of these experiences, inevitably you're never answering a question as much as you're opening so many more new questions. Like you're opening the field of the possible questions to these horizons that are unachievable in a lot of ways.
Well, that reminds me, or it makes me think about my approach to the Hebrew Bible, which I spend a
Mhm.
lot of time in. There's a lot of ways of interpreting the text. What is the text
Yeah.
saying? But there's a saying in I guess the Talmud, more or less, that the interpretation should never stray from the plain meaning.
Uh,
Um, so you have to, stay rooted in the everyday reality. Like you could, speculate about what the Garden of Eden was, like what the snake was, who Adam and Eve were, and you can riff off of those ideas or those notions, till the cows come home. But first you need to look carefully at what the text is actually saying. Is it past tense, future tense? Is it is it the plural pronoun or the singular pronoun? What exactly is, what are the words actually saying?
yeah.
And once you have a keen understanding or a thorough understanding of the words, then you have the prerogative, so to speak, of extrapolating what those words might mean beyond the plain meaning. But you need to start with the plain meaning. And so when we were talking about the glasses of water, like I'm a plain meaning kind of guy. I'm thinking glasses of water, somebody's thirsty.
Right.
As opposed to anything else.
One of the things we have brushed up against, but not really gone into too deeply, is endogenous DMT and the role of endogenous DMT. The theory forever was that the pineal gland produces endogenous DMT. To my knowledge, that was shown to be the case in other mammals, but because of how difficult it is to probe in a human brain, that hadn't been shown. But I've heard like I feel like I've heard arguments back and forth on that. Where is the science on that? And yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, it's a long and winding road about endogenous DMT. Yeah, it was first discovered in rabbit lung. And people thought that the lungs made DMT, and in fact, there used to be a joke, I guess in quotes, a joke that schizophrenia was a lung disease. That the lungs and
Ah,
schizophrenics were producing too much DMT. But it turns out that the way the lungs made DMT in those experiments was if you if if you got a rabbit lung, which contains high levels of enzymes which are responsible for making DMT, if you homogenize the rabbit lung and you put in the ingredients to make DMT, out comes DMT. But they never looked at whole rabbit lung. It was
Hmm.
only homogenized rabbit lung in a blender. Uh, yeah, yeah. So,
That's a nice way to put
um,
it.
yeah, yeah,
Homogenized sounds better.
yeah, homogenized. Yeah. So in the 1990s, maybe the early 2000s, the early 90s, I can't remember. There were some, genetic, studies, looking, for the enzymes responsible for making DMT in the body, and they occurred in separate, cells in the lungs. And if you're going to be making a compound in a nerve cell, you need all of the enzymes in that one in that one type of cell. And it turned out that the lung contained those enzymes, but but they occurred in different cell types. So the lung theory went out the went out the door.
I didn't know that. Okay.
And then a few years later, well, I'm a few years after the DMT book came out. I heard from a pineal melatonin expert in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Jimo Borjigan, a Mongolian neuroscientist, who had been studying the pineal gland for her whole life and had
Hmm.
never heard of DMT.
Oh,
And in the spirit molecule, I do lay out a strong, uh, circumstantial case for the pineal gland making DMT. The enzymes are there, the precursors are there. Yeah, and she was convinced that it was worth looking into. So they published a paper in 2016,
okay.
2016, 2013. My mind is kind of I think 2016, demonstrating measurable levels of DMT in the fluid surrounding the pineal gland of the living rat.
Hmm.
So that like at the time established that the pineal makes DMT. So there were lots of objections to that idea. That the concentrations were too low. I think was the main concern. But even so, the pineal gland is in the middle of the brain,
Yeah.
and even if the concentrations were quite low, there's surrounding brain structures which are responsive to quite low levels of compounds. So the low concentrations that were measured in the fluid around the gland, I don't think were any kind of no go zone. Um, but then a few years later, 2019, um, the same group in Ann Arbor, looked at brain levels of DMT, and they were looking for the co-localization of the two necessary enzymes in individual nerve cells,
Hmm.
as opposed to being in different kinds of pulmonary cells. So they demonstrated co-localization of the two necessary enzymes in neurons in the cortex of living rodents or of dead rodents. But concentrations of those enzymes were visualizable, and they also were able to measure levels of DMT in the cortex in rodents that were quite high, comparable to serotonin and to dopamine. So in some ways, those data pointed at the possible existence of a DMT neurotransmitter system, comparable to serotonin and to dopamine.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, that they weren't able to find DMT in the pineal,
Hmm.
even though there was co-localization of the enzymes, and you know, uh, there were reasonable quantities of the necessary precursors. So they concluded vis-a-vis that original pineal study, that this that the probe which they used to measure the fluid levels of DMT in the pineal were snagging brain tissue on the way in and on the way out.
Sure.
And what the original 2013 paper was measuring were brain levels of DMT. So they established in this 2019 paper that, that there are, very high levels of DMT in the rodent brain. They also, looked at human brain, for the co-localization of the necessary enzymes. And, they were, co-localized in human brain as well. But they didn't, look, for DMT in the human brain. But it makes, sense, that there would be, DMT in human brain. One of the interesting, parts of that 2019 study is they experimentally caused cardiac arrest in their experimental animals.
Oh, wow.
And concentrations of DMT went up 5-fold.
Wow.
In the visual cortex of all places. So that really strengthens the proposal that there's some role for naturally occurring DMT in at least some aspects of the near-death state. And you have to wonder as well, if there is a DMT neurotransmitter system, which is a regulating,
right?
And so one could go down some pretty deep rabbit holes along that line.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So interesting. So it seems like there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that assumption is correct. And I didn't know that there was this research linking it directly to cardiac arrest. That is really interesting. Yeah.
Well, they killed the animals and then measured levels of DMT in brain.
So one thing that's interesting about this, and I'd like to get your opinion on it, is that there's this whole grammar that you hear about with near-death experiences, this whole archetypal grammar of essentially leaving your body, realizing you're dead, feeling like a guiding figure in the form of like, a dead loved one or a angelic or psychopomp type figure comes, and then you go through this whole process, at least until you go back to your body. And although that sounds psychedelic, most people who smoke DMT or have a heroic dose type experience, it's not exactly that, and it's not like exactly as cohesive or as archetypally clearly like about death as the near death experience is. So there's some open questions that implies, like if it is DMT secreting in an elevated amount during cardiac arrest, it doesn't quite seem like the experience is fully reducible to just tripping on DMT, right?
Yeah, I think so. Well, one of the issues is also set and setting.
True.
Like when you have an NDE, you're in a particular set and setting. You've been in a car accident, for
Sure.
example. Yeah, as opposed to you being in a lab getting an injection of your DMT in your vein. One of the volunteers in the DMT study was a nurse very keen on the NDE. She studied it. She read books. She went to workshops. And she was the only person in the study with more or less classical kind of NDE. There was a tunnel, there was light, there were figures alongside.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think if you prime yourself, you can perhaps have a near death experience in a lab. But I think those may be a lot more common with spontaneous ones. There were some studies a few years back, comparing scores on various questionnaires in people, that had a spontaneous NDE, and comparing those scores with scores that were that resulted from people filling out the same questionnaires after a number of different drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a British study. I think it was done by the Imperial College Group, which demonstrated that the greatest correspondence was between DMT and the NDE.
Mm.
A French study came out a few months later, actually, which demonstrated that ketamine was a better candidate for pharmacological
Mm.
model for the NDE.
That makes sense.
And there was a recent new study by the Imperial Group, looking at NDE and DMT effects. It would be a fairly simple study to do. You get people that have had a spontaneous NDE, give them DMT, ask them to compare. And I've gotten a handful of emails from people over the years, and it's inconsistent. Some people say, "Oh yeah, I smoked DMT years after my own NDE, and they were just spot on, identical." And others, say they're very different. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the jury is still out. But it would not be a hard um, study to do. Same thing with the alien
Yeah.
abduction
Yeah.
experience. Give those guys your DMT, ask them to compare the two states. But for whatever reason, those studies haven't been done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always, with these conversations about the relationship between a molecule that is so vastly altering your perception of reality, it gets into these questions about, you know, of course, endogenous versus exogenous, what's inside, what's outside. Is the is that whole paradigm, that whole dualistic paradigm dissolving when you're in these states to a point where it becomes an absurd question altogether? You know, as someone who's been around this milieu for so long, who has been exploring their consciousness for so long, both on the natch through meditation and otherwise, where are you lying right now on that question? More specifically, the relationship between brain, mind, reality itself is start because you're using the phrase brain mind complex a lot. Um, what exactly in your mind does the brain have to do with the mind? Are you Do you think this is reducible to brain states? Do you think brain states are representative, or do you think the brain is a receiver?
Well, I don't think about it all that much these days
Mm.
because it's just so difficult to answer. Um, yeah, I suppose. Well, yet if you speak with or if you interact with somebody with no brain, there's no one home. There's no mind and a person with no brain. Um, yeah, so the mind is dependent on the brain in some way. Whether as a receiving organ or as a generative organ. Um, yeah, it's just hard to say. It reminds me of a bit of an exchange that that Rogan and I had about the reality of the biblical narratives, and like was there in the Garden of Eden,
Yeah.
were there two people named Adam and Eve, and I responded with the same with the same answer I needed to come up with when I was beginning my studies with DMT. Like at first when people were able to just start describing what just occurred under the influence of DMT and the visions and the voices and the
Mm.
entities and all that, I was treating them as something else, like it was their brain on drugs, or it was Jungian archetypes, or it was your Freudian conflicts and impulses being visualized. But it was a way of looking at the experience as if it were something else. And the volunteers really weren't satisfied with my approach. They were they wanted to say, No, what I just experienced was my, like I was seeing these reptilian creatures open up
Yeah.
their chests and displaying the process of birth and of creation to me. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a vision. It was like being there.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
more real than real. And after a short period of time, I needed to do a thought experiment, which was to take at face value what people were describing. I began to treat the DMT state as if it were real. And once you do that, then the whole, then the whole, world opens up.
Yeah.
Like there's inhabitants, there's rules of what occurs, one thing after the other. There's time and there's space, which cohere in a unique manner. So in the same way with Joe the other day, and I was saying, well, those stories I interact, I relate to those narratives as if they were real. And once you do that, the whole thing opens up, and you can start to really tap into the information contained in whatever it is that's going on there. The hallmark of the DMT state is it feels more real than real.
Yeah.
And that's undeniable. So are you going to completely disregard something that feels more real than real? You can't really do that with a straight face. So you can, I guess, understand it as going on in parallel to this universe. You tap into it, and things have progressed since the last time you were there. So it seems that as if it has some temporal continuity. Things occur there, they take place there, you witness them, you interact with them, you influence them. So I think that might be a long-winded, obscure answer to your question.
Well, I get you. You've got to apply nuance to it because it's just it's one of those things that we cannot empirically answer. Yet, to your point, it's so subjectively impactful and real that you can't just dismiss it as like, oh, it's a hallucination, or oh, it's something that's an inconsequential throwaway that's just a mind experiencing a drug. So I think it needs to be a nuanced answer. Um, but one of the ideas that's just an additional mind fuck that I can't stop bringing up ever since I had this conversation is, do you know Dr. Jeff Kripal?
Oh yeah.
He came on the show, and we were talking about. He said something to me to the effect of, "I take the experience, the phenomenon seriously, but I don't take the images seriously, or I don't take them literally." I think is what he said. And making that distinction is one, really powerful and interesting, but two, like I said, brings this whole other layer of mindfuckery to the conversation, because what that implies then is that you really are, let's say in a DMT experience, you really are interacting with something that's there. But the way that it presents to the individual, the all of the subjective factors of it are probably going to be somewhat different. And we're not even talking about just the interpretation after the fact, but the way that it actually presents. So then is that some part of the cognitive apparatus, the perceptory apparatus of our own brains struggling? Is that agency choosing to present itself in some way? Is some tertiary thing that I can't even think of? In my experience, I think he's right. I've always been incredulous of both my own struggles to interpret my experiences and other people's, who are even people who are very insistent that they think I had an experience with this specific entity. I'm always, I always have a healthy dose of skepticism, while like him taking the phenomenon itself very seriously.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is the overwhelming sense of reality, which occurs with DMT and with other psychedelics. But I think especially with DMT, is if, like if it is, if it is simply, the brain on drugs, that suggests a reality, center in the brain, which we keep at bay in a narrow window, like in everyday life, consensus
Hmm.
reality, so to speak. And under the influence of a drug, you know, that, that reality, center or nucleus in the brain is, it's amped up. So if that's the case, what is, regulating on an everyday, basis, that reality, mediating center, and could that be the function of endogenous, uh, DMT, for example? Um, yeah, so, another thing which, comes up occasionally is, if that's the case, if naturally occurring DMT in the brain is like a, reality thermostat, keeping things
Hmm.
in a narrow range,
Yeah.
um, does that mean we are, living in a simulation, like
Yeah. Right.
DMT simulation? And I spent some time thinking and even worrying about that, but before we can establish whether or not, that's true, we need to, face, the fact, that even if that, that were true, our behavior still has consequences.
Yeah.
If we, do this, then that occurs. If we, do that, then, this occurs. There still is cause and effect, even if it were a, DMT simulation. So I'm at a practical level on, like on an everyday basis. I don't think it makes much of a difference. And I think, the specific entity one speaks with, let's say the specific information which one receives. I was, thinking about, Francis Crick, like, he
Hmm.
took
Hmm.
LSD, visualized the double helix.
Hmm.
Only Francis Crick could have done that back in the day, so it
Right.
was, it was unique to him. So to, think about a repository of information that everybody can, tap into with a high enough, dose of, psychedelic, I think, dispenses with the more, crucial, notion of, set and setting.
Yeah, for
Who's
sure.
the person tripping and in what
Yeah.
context?
Yeah, I think one of the maybe it's like the way that we say set and setting, people have this knee jerk feeling of, yeah, set and setting, it's important, but I mean, I'm taking something very powerful and that usurp like another way, like here's a level of set and setting I don't think a lot of people think about. Your specific being itself is a massive part of the equation of what happens when you go to these far out states of consciousness, and your the manifestation of everything that is you accessing whatever these spaces are is going to look fundamentally different than anyone else having this experience. So it's not just like where you are and what's going on in your life, it's the collective being that you are as a person at this time in this place. And that's so profoundly massive that I don't think we appreciate it enough when we say things like set and setting, or at least most people I don't think do. Um, one of the things I wanted to specifically ask you, though, as someone who's been such an exhaustive seeker for so many decades, um, you've dabbled in many techniques, and because you've been entertaining this idea of endogenous DMT potentially being an important element of reaching expanded states of consciousness, what for you have been the most impactful techniques to that effect? Do you think that there are ideal ways to potentially tap into that endogenous DMT? Are you somewhat skeptical of this idea that you're doing that through meditation or breathing exercises? What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, to get back to your point about a more expansive, view,
Hmm.
of, the notion of the, one's, set. Yeah, like I like to think of, it along the lines of, the drugs are are working on, well, the only thing that the drugs are working on is who you are, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Stan Groff likes, saying that psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers
Right.
of the unconscious, but I think it can be seen at a broader level that they're non-specific amplifiers of everything more or less conscious in one's mind.
Right.
If you're studying X, Y, and Z, thoroughly all the time, then on the trip you'll be thinking about those things. Those things will come up. Yeah, the drugs aren't working on anything else than your individual self, your body, your mind, your unconscious, your preconscious, your conscious mind, your soul. Yeah, that's all they work on. Like you put LSD into it, your tissue culture. The tissue, culture isn't having an experience, but if you put it into a mind brain complex, then you have an experience that's unique to you. So I think, yeah, set needs to be, seen in a more expansive manner. Um, technique wise, or, like altered states that resemble those brought on by DMT. Yeah. Well, we don't yet know what raises levels of DMT, in the brain. Well, in experimental animals, death elevates
Yeah.
levels of DMT. Yeah, but otherwise, we don't know if levels increase in dreams, near death states. Well, near death states, perhaps, meditation, creativity, flow, psychosis, anything like that. You know, um, you know, to the extent that non-drug states resemble those brought on by DMT, it makes, sense, that endogenous, DMT is, playing a role. But um, but we don't, have the data yet. Uh, one of the people that was working in the Ann Arbor lab is a postdoc in La Jolla now, John Dean,
Mm.
and he's quite, keen on working on, visualizing, the synthesis of DMT in the living human, using, functional magnetic, uh, resonance imaging
Mm-hmm.
spectroscopy.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can see, signals of amino acids, DMT, precursors,
Wow.
being elevated or being present. Yeah, and he's, slowly but, surely, working on, being able, to measure, the activity, of DMT synthesis. Yeah, but the concentrations in the blood are quite low, and we aren't able, to measure, them with any accuracy right now. So we need to, look into the brain. Um,
Can I ask a question of, are they quite low? I get that they're difficult to measure, and that's one problem. But when we say that they're quite low, are they too low to be psychoactively relevant, or are they just too low to measure, do you think?
well, both really.
Okay.
If you can't, if you aren't able, if you aren't able to measure, DMT in the blood on a, baseline kind of everyday basis, clearly, those are non-psychoactive levels.
Mm-hmm.
We were able to measure DMT after, giving it. It was in the nanograms, per mole.
Okay.
Um, but naturally, occurring concentrations are in, the billionths of a gram, per mil. So like an order, like, 10, like 1,000 times more, no, nanogram, picogram, yeah, like 1,000 times, lower, than the ones, or 10 times lower, lower.
Yeah, much lower. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
much lower. Yeah, so, whether, so concentrations, are quite low, but, concentrations in the blood aren't, necessarily a reflection of, concentrations in the brain.
Right.
And especially with, the very short half-life of DMT, it's, broken down almost immediately after it's, synthesized. like within a minute or so, and it may occur even more quickly in the brain. Like it's regulated on a moment to moment kind of basis in the brain, most likely. Yeah, so by the time any remaining DMT makes its way into the blood, the concentrations may not reflect at all what's been going on in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And the metabolites uh, of DMT aren't specific to DMT. They're
Okay.
they occur as a result of the breakdown of serotonin and of tryptamine and a number of other compounds. So you can't even indirectly measure the activity of DMT in brain by looking at breakdown products in the blood.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so uh, the methods that I've used over the years, and I've been lucky, to have been able, to pursue a number of tried and true traditions of altering one's consciousness over the years, and to study them in depth. Um, Drugs. I mean, obviously,
Right.
are are quite reliable ways of altering consciousness. Your meditation, generally, at least the kind of meditations that I learned and have been practicing over the years, isn't necessarily one geared towards visions.
Right.
Mostly towards insights, relaxation, kind of appearing through the superficial perception of of cause and effect. There is one uh, a story, one chapter in the new book about a meditation experience which occurred, staring at,
Yeah.
being absorbed into a spinning Tibetan, a huge, weighty cylinder in
Yeah.
the prayer room.
I was going to ask
Yeah,
about this one. Yeah.
yeah. So that was quite psychedelic. It was a vision of me as an infant, with my parents. It was a very unpleasant vision, and it meant you may have reflected a real historical event, but I think it was more of the nature of a dream, like a condensed version of a lot, or you condensed a condensation of a number of the dynamics and interactions which occurred when I was an infant between my parents and me. Um,
How long did it seem like wanted to ask is how long did it seem like it lasted? Like how like the transmission of that experience itself, was it just like a sudden instantaneous thing? Is it hard to uh ex, like exp, to know? I'm just asking because I'm coming off of this retreat myself, and I had several moments of just that really were closer, just to what you're describing, to just deep relaxation, deep disassociation from my body. Not not much going on in terms of visual scapes or anything like that, but it would be punctuated by occasional, just almost like flashes of things that would
Mhm.
just seem to be transmitted almost instantly. Um, so I was curious if it was an experience like that or if it seemed like it had some kind of narrative duration.
Well, the onset occurred, suddenly. Like I was, struggling to break through certain personal problems, certain issues, and it was, non-visual, non-perceptual. Yeah, and I just pushed and pushed and pushed. I had been meditating, quite, seriously for a couple of years by then, like a couple hours a day, chanting and reading scripture. My practice was fairly well grounded by then. So I just pushed and pushed and pushed, and I broke through. It was a sudden breakthrough, like boom,
Hmm.
like that, and I was in this crazy, crazy world.
Wow.
And it lasted, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then started fading away.
When you say you were in this crazy world, aside from that vision, what do you mean by that?
Well, it was a world of craziness. Like, my parents
Oh, yeah.
were doing like horrible things to me as an infant, and I was just terrified, and it just seemed completely insane.
Right.
Yeah, it was like I mean, it was entry into a world of insanity, and thankfully, it was just the result of it, meditation and this and this the spinning wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, molestation and envy and hatred and all that kind of
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's very cyclical and karmic and samsaric and all of those things. Um, yeah, it's just so interesting how in these states that are on the natch, how mild and calm they are 99% of the time, but then just sometimes things like that happen. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's another episode that I recount about lying on the couch in my analyst's office. You're free associating, which is uh, a slightly altered state. You just
mhm.
speak whatever comes to your mind. There isn't any censoring at all. You just speak like
Yeah.
you have a thought and you say it. Yeah. And I was doing that, for years, many days a week. Yeah. And most of the time you're free associate. You might cry, you might remember things, but it isn't, psychedelic at all. One day went into my analyst's office, I laid down and I had a pseudo seizure. I just started flopping around on the couch and I could barely breathe. I couldn't speak. I was salivating and mucus and just completely nuts. Yeah. Which was absolutely
Yeah. Yeah.
unexpected. Yeah. So, like you said, 99% of the time it's, just, and then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
boom,
You
something out
just
of the blue hits you.
Yeah, you just hit a psychic landmine all of a sudden. That is almost just like, those states are reminiscent of like heroic dose level experiences that um unfortunately last much longer, and you can't just like leave your analyst's room an hour later and be back to normal during those states, for better and for worse. But yeah, it goes to show that I think that there is this system of somatic psychological correspondences that we don't understand how to tap into, particularly in everyday metacognating, ego based reality. And then clearly in psychedelic states, that logic just doesn't apply. Like there are, you can stumble over things in a way that is very real and very visceral in a way that wouldn't make sense in that kind of waking consciousness. However, you still can trip those triggers somehow on the natch, but not reliably, at least in my case. Anything that I've experienced to the degree that you're talking about, which are very few things, by the way, I never have any idea how I got there. The out of body experience I mentioned, I had no idea how or what combination of things triggered that, because I had been doing, that was my, I don't know, probably 25th meditation in the last few days. So, why that time? Why that specific? I can't answer that question. And I was wondering if you have any insight onto that, how you begin to tap into that. I don't know, that non literal visionary psychospiritual material.
Yeah, yeah, I just don't know. I mean, you keep at it, I
Yes.
guess. Practice makes perfect, or at least practice helps. Um, yeah, yeah, like it's anything else. You just work at it long enough, and hopefully, something will come of it. A couple of the volunteers in my study, they would come out of the DMT state and they'd say, "Oh, can't you get this way with meditation?"
Right.
And I would laugh and say, "Good luck."
You're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because it's quite hard. Like drugs, they're pharmacological agents and they're reliable, but they may not be the best way ultimately to make sense of your life and the world you live in.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you,
They can give you like a glimpse of something that you then need to work on a bit more steadily. Um, yeah, but why? a certain time and why, not a other time. Rick Tarnas, might have,
Yeah.
some insights about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Could, and honestly, when we were talking about the weird visions people would have, that's one of the other things I was thinking of is, like what's going on archetypally, what's going on astrologically. Could that be unconsciously influencing people? It's, yeah. I mean, in my mind, it's an open question. Um, I this new book is a really big deal. I can very obviously for you, it's so personal. You share so many things in the book that you hadn't shared before. But I'm wondering if we're getting deep into the conversation now, and we've talked about some instances in the book.
Right.
But what do you? I guess to nutshell it, what do you want people to know about this book?
Yeah. Well, I wrote the book for a couple of reasons. One is I was, looking, for the next thing to write. Yeah, and I've accumulated, quite a few accounts of altered states over the years. Yeah, and a fairly common question that I've been getting over the years is how did you get into this line of work? Yeah, and so the best answer is research is me search, right? I
Yeah.
was interested in understanding my life, and I found a way to study it experimentally, um, with psychedelics and their effects on the mind. So uh, yeah, so I think it's an answer to how I got into this line of work, and they're good stories.
Yeah.
I like telling stories. And there's some good stories, and I think perhaps most important is to give a more nuanced account of altered states. They're not all good, they're not all bad, they're not anything other than mind manifesting. So after each of these experiences which I recount, I have a commentary section which describes or discusses how that state came about. Like, for example, the active intellect and
Hmm.
the medievalists, or psychopharmacology and the default mode network, or
Yeah.
alcohol's effects on on neurotransmitters. Um, yeah, so it's an opportunity, or it's an example of how you can kind of look at your life through the perspective of the altered states that have really stood out, which means you need to pay attention to your altered states. You need to write them down, think about them, look at them, talk about them with people, and see what their influence has been, what kind of information you've gleaned from them. Um, yeah, so I guess those are the reasons. I sub people can order books through me, and through my website, and I inscribe them before
Oh, cool.
I send them out. And one of the inscriptions that I've been finding myself including is never stay down for long.
Mm, love that.
Yeah, so that seems to be like a meme that's coming out vis-a-vis this book, and interacting with people about it.
Yeah, that has a lot of practical uses. That's definitely a good inscription. You never know what you're going to catch people in, what kind of ruts, what kind of situations. But one of the things I love about it is that it's so easy to get complacent in life, and when you're getting complacent, or even if you're just getting overwhelmed with the things that you have to do, one of the easiest things to dispense with or make excuses to not do is this kind of exploration. Like you've really got to make it a priority in your own life, or you're just going to find yourself not doing it. Like, but before this retreat that I just did, I even got to this point of feeling a little bit like a fraud, because I'm talking about this stuff intellectually all the time. Like, this is my job to, to talk about this stuff. And I was finding myself being like, I haven't had an impactful consciousness based experience in like a couple of years at this point, and I really need to get into the field. Stop talking about it intellectually, like turn the frontal lobe off and experience it, be in these states. And every time I do that, I'm so just almost embarrassed that I haven't been doing it more. And I feel like your book is a not that every story is positive by any means, or it's all like, sunshine and rainbows and like, but it does just show that there is this fertile, novel, interesting, soul nourishing possibilities out there, and such a variety of experiences that people can have.
Yeah, well, good. I'm happy to hear that. Yeah, it was a bit of a risk, getting that book out there, and it was no fun going through some of those hairy
Right.
chapters. Yeah, like, oh man, was I crazy or what? Yeah, so, uh, y- y- yeah, and those accounts obviously I've toned down, and I've removed some of the disgusting parts. Like I want people to feel empathy, but not like disgust.
Mm-hmm.
So I remove the disgusting parts. Yeah, but still, I felt good once the book was done. Like I really processed a lot of stuff, and I was able to approach it like almost clinically, like like a case report, and then you discuss the case
Yeah.
after each of those episodes. So um, yeah, and I think there are some some humorous parts in there. Like the steak on acid chapter. That's pretty hilarious. I
Yeah.
came back after LSD in the mountains, and I had steak in the cafeteria, and I stabbed it, and it was like squirming and pulling away from me. And yeah, I was a vegetarian for a number of years after that, to be honest. So yeah, there's some pretty good stories.
Before I let you go, what research do you want to see done? Now that we've got, we're deep into this, what everybody's calling like the psychedelic renaissance, or at the very least, it's much easier to actually do this research and ask some of these questions.
Mhm.
What are you hoping to see? What are you curious to see?
Well, there's a couple things, I guess, and like once we got off the call, I'll think of some methods
Right. Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
You know, one of them is to uh, crack the DMT synthesizing machinery. What turns on endogenous synthesis of DMT. So I think then we'll be able to start asking, what is the role of endogenous DMT? Is it a way for the soul to leave the body as you die? Is it responsible for dreaming? Is it responsible for psychosis?
Yeah.
What happens if your levels are very low? Does that mean you're depressed? What happens if you blockade the production of endogenous DMT? So I think the role of endogenous DMT and what regulates it is very important. I think at a more broad level, we need to know how psychedelics work. And if you think about how or what psychedelics are doing, they seem to be panaceas. So you get what you're looking for. If you're
Yeah.
depressed, you'll get less depressed. If you want to be creative, you'll be more creative. If you want to be a Charles Manson, serial killer, you'll be more convinced that that's the path for you, and understand why it's right, for you to pursue it. And when you're speaking about panaceas, you're talking about the placebo effect.
Right.
You have an expectation, and you are given a drug, and certain things occur which you were hoping to occur. So the placebo effect isn't imaginary. It's not all
Right.
in your mind. There's a lot of biological concomitants of a placebo response. If you do placebo analgesia with hypnosis, let's say, and you give an opiate blocking drug, the analgesia goes away. So
Mm.
placebo is a real biological thing, and psychotherapy could be even seen as a placebo uh, kind of treatment. And with effective psychotherapy, there's brain changes. So the placebo response is a real marshaling of the body's innate healing mechanisms. So I think that psychedelics will shed light on the placebo response, which I think is occurring all day long, every day in everybody's life. Like there are certain things which occur in your life that convince you of certain ideas or
Mhm.
certain ways of being or of relating with the world. and certain, and the majority of experiences over the course of a day, they don't really register. um so one of the most interesting aspects of psychedelics is they're feeling more real than real.
Right.
And uh you know uh, like another uh, term is meaningfulness enhancement. You know they enhance the meaning of particular
Yeah.
experiences. And I think the placebo response, it hinges on the experience being meaningful,
Right.
profound, more real than real. So if you could marshal the placebo response with psychedelics, you would open up this huge panorama of treatments for placebo responsive conditions, which are most of the psychiatric disorders, autoimmune diseases, inflammatory diseases, all kinds of things which show a strong placebo response. So I think rather than being entheogenic or psychotomimetic or whatnot, they may enhance the placebo response. And understanding the placebo response, which is the translation of a subjective experience into a biological one,
Mm-hmm.
will help bridge the explanatory, gap,
Mm-hmm.
which is the black hole between subjective experience and psychopharmacology. I think that if psychedelics can help us understand the placebo response, which is the translation of psychology into biology, I think we'll open up a new way of looking at the mind brain complex.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All those questions. I've thought of many of those too. And yeah, that relationship between the placebo and what we call the placebo, really this faculty in the mind that is a not, I don't know, it's like a non-literal switch or something. It's like something that can somehow be accessed through a mixture of intention and input, where the input itself is not the cause of the change. And then there's this like tertiary factor of the mind that somehow plays a role that we don't understand, that seems to be always hidden just around a corner, and we can see the effect of it, but we can't figure out how to directly interact with it. Do you have any additional thoughts on the placebo?
That's them in a nutshell. Yeah, yeah. The placebo response is a bridge, between the mind and the body, which has yet to be fully understood. It's incomprehensible.
Yeah.
It occurs behind the scenes too.
Right.
You have no idea you're activating your brain's own mind brain complex innate healing properties or mechanisms. Um, yeah. It might end up being incomprehensible and invisible, but I think we can understand it, somewhat better,
Yeah.
and even utilize it. It also could be utilized for the wrong reason. You can convince
Yeah.
certain people of certain things being true, and for them it's true, and they could be malignant ideas or malignant courses of action.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if they're if it is going to be studied and applied, then it's up to us to be moral in our application.
Definitely. Yeah, it's starting to, it starts to feel like you're bordering on magical territory when you're starting to play with these unseen switches in that are deep, that have a deep impact on people's psyche and their body potentially. Um yeah, it's almost like black magic if you wield it in the wrong way.
Yeah, well, of PK Dick's work, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. One of my favorite books of his is The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and it's about the competition between uh, two psychedelics for world domination.
Oh wow.
You, one is one is a compound you made on Earth, and it's a typical escapism, kind of psychedelic. You enter into the world of Perky Pat, who's this little doll, and you interact with her friends, and you go to her house and you hang out and all that. The other is this extraterrestrial, interstellar, uh, um, psychedelic, which is completely weird. You take it and you never really come down. You do come down, but you're still like in another trip, and then you come down from that trip, and you're in another one, and it's a terrifying description of how psychedelics could go really wrong forever. So yeah, I think it's it's a crapshoot right now. How this information is going to be applied.
Yeah. Fascinating. This whole conversation has been absolutely fantastic. It's an honor to have you back here. So excited for your new book. And just thank you for doing it. Let's do it again.
Well, sure, Michael. Yeah, it was great. We ought not to wait another 8 years.
Yes, agreed.